Jan, good morning.
Morning, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Always a pleasure. Episode 5. I think we're going pretty well in terms of the cadence. Episode 5 of the Growth Ripples podcast. Are we making waves yet? Oh, Jan, or
Well, I think we're definitely making some ripples. I wouldn't say yet we're on the trajectory of Joe Rogan's level of kind of coverage, if you like, but that's
yeah,
fine with me. I think as long as we're hitting a chord for a number of key people out there that kind of enjoy what we're talking about and really want to make organizations a better place to work.
fantastic. So, Jan, I know you submitted another questionnaire on your LinkedIn to your network,
Mhm.
and a bit of a resounding sort of vote of confidence in terms of the next topic that we're going to chat about. What does one, or how does one handle a workplace bullying incident? I think that sort of resonates quite well. Bit of a timeless topic. How do we do
Yeah.
it, Jan?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think what it sort of says to me is, one, it's very topical. We're
Mm,
seeing a lot of it in the media. But I think the more concerning piece there is that I imagine there's a lot of people out there, both here locally in Australia, but also internationally, that are experiencing or
mm,
have people they care about that are experiencing bullying. So, I mean, it's a big concern, but also it's an area of passion, as you know, Jeff, for me, and big part of what we like to do at Growth Wave is help organizations address these things because I believe that no one should go to a workplace where they're bullied, no matter how much they get paid, no matter what they do in their jobs. No one
mm.
deserves to be bullied. I think it's kind of inhumane, if you like. So I'm more than happy to share some of my experiences because I've been working in this field for over 17 years and I've had to investigate bullying. I've had to
Mm.
advise on bullying cases, both inside organizations and external. Within organizations, I've also helped friends and family deal with or address bullying. And even as we've talked about, I've experienced my own bullying in organizations where I've had to take action both internally and externally when
Mm.
when that's happened to me. So more than happy to share some of that. And Jeff, again, be great if you ask me any questions that you think our
Yeah.
listeners and watchers might want to hear.
And I understand that we've now got a bit of a global audience, which is pretty cool. Now, I understand when it comes to handling this situation, there is some sort of common approach, but at the same time, we need to be aware of sort of local laws. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for bringing that up, Jeff. So I'm more of an expert, I suppose, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm more of an expert in the laws around bullying, harassment, and discrimination as they are in Australia.
Mm,
Now, some of those principles would be universal, but in terms of the legislation or the laws, they're most prevalent one in Australia, given that's where we are, but also countries that have followed kind of the British way of law, particularly employment law. So in
mm.
the UK, there's some similarities. Canada, Hong Kong have even got some similarities
Yeah.
given the history there.
Yeah.
But I really want to sort of put a caveat that anything I talk about, particularly on a legislative sort of front, it's much more Australian focused. But in terms of those principles, what that really comes back down to is the human element. So how do we address something that we believe we've been wronged by, some
Mm,
sort of social injustice, if you like. And that's where I think bullying falls into that realm, even if we sort of park the legal element to a side. But bullying, maybe if we even just define that quickly, Jeff, it's anything that's repeated. And it's repeated in a way that could be humiliating, could be demoralizing, could be insulting to people. So,
mm,
at least in Australia, the way that has evolved from a legislative or workplace front is to try to capture some of those things that wouldn't be captured in, say, harassment. So, harassment is usually, at least one-off events. Usually, they're quite sharp, as in you can really tell
mm.
when you see those.
Very
Whereas
acute, so to speak.
exactly, yeah, great word there, acute. Whereas bullying, that also encompasses smaller things that might not be easily picked up on a one-off occasion. So, for example, if your manager or if someone in your team is deliberately withholding information that helps you do your job, that
Mm,
could be seen, again, depending on the laws, but could be seen as bullying because that's actually preventing you from doing your job and it's inhibiting your abilities again to kind of function and perform in the workplace. So bullying is much more all encompassing, if you like, and it's much more
mm.
of a repeated type activity. But I think otherwise people generally have a bit of a sense around bullying. But of course, it's always good to check with a friend, a trusted person, or local regulators. So in Australia, for example, there's the Fair Work Commission where they happily take calls from the general public for free, confidentially. So you can always discuss that with them or a lawyer, which, depending on your financial situation, may or may not be, prohibitive to you.
Mm.
But yeah, I really want to talk about the actual things to do, the step by step.
Yeah, because these things seem very nuanced, very sort of potentially under the radar
Yes,
in a
yeah.
way.
Absolutely. And look, we don't have time, Jeff, to kind of go through every single permutation of what
Mm.
happens. But I think what I think is most useful, hopefully, for our listeners and people that are watching this, is that number one is around needing to decide, where do you start the conversation. So bullying, when it first picks up, sometimes people don't even really identify with it, or they feel like they're being gaslit, or they're not even aware of what's going on. So let's jump ahead in terms of, once you're aware and you feel as though some bullying is taking place, the first thing to do is decide who you want to go to. So if there is trust, if you believe you can trust your line manager, the person you report to, and
Hmm.
assuming they're not the one who's bullying you, I would always recommend starting there. Because that's the person that is most likely going to be able to help you with addressing it. Now, of course, that's not always the case. The
Mm.
other options internally is just to speak to HR or the two-up manager of your manager's manager. But again, all of that comes with the caveat that you need to make sure that, one, you trust those individuals,
Mm.
and two, that they're not actually engaging in it. And not you don't always know. And I know I've been in the situation where I was pretty sure that the senior leadership were not involved in some bullying, but then when I escalated things, it kind of came clear that they were more interested in covering up rather than addressing it. So I
Mm.
think that's the first bit. Now, the second bit, so let's assume you've gone those sort of actions, you've looked at your policies within your company, you've seen what they say about conduct, raising grievances or complaints, you've taken or at least looked at whether they make sense to you. And often, and we're seeing more companies do this, is providing an opportunity to raise complaints in a confidential kind of whistleblower way that doesn't identify you. So that's another potentially good way to address it. The only thing I would say about that is, though, number one, if it's all confidential, you might not kind of get to the outcomes that you want, because
Mm. It's a bit too
you can't
general in
even
a way.
list. Yeah, and you might not be able to even list yourself for fear of retribution. You might not be able to list the person who's bullying you because, again, it might be identifiable back to you. But that is one avenue people can take.
Mm.
So first two, number one is your manager, followed by two-up manager or HR.
Depending on the trust, like what you
Yeah,
said.
exactly. Depending on the
Okay.
trust. Number two is like looking at the if there's any whistleblower kind of confidential ways to raise issues.
Hmm.
And then number three is, if and know those things haven't worked or there's not enough trust to do any of those two, then going external. And this is where there's a few options. So again, in Australia, I'll just remind people, Fair Work Commission is a confidential free service. People can kind of avail of that as the options. They can advise. There's lawyers. Now, depending, again, financial situation, sometimes you can get financial support, go to legal aid. If that's relevant in your country. In Australia, there is the legal aid. They're sometimes under-resourced, but that can be an option as well. But there are a lot of things, again, within Australia and a lot of the Commonwealth countries, where you can take action which will be very low cost. So Fair Work, for example, allows people to submit for stop bullying orders. So what that means is you make a submission. I don't even know if there's a application fee. There may be, but
Mm.
I'm pretty sure it's pretty small, even if it does exist. And then they will hear any cases in a confidential way and determine whether stop bullying. So that's where they order someone to stop bullying or treating someone in a negative way. So that can be quite effective. And we're seeing more of the legislation be ramped up in this area, particularly around sexual harassment. So we're
Mm.
seeing some changes there as we speak. But then the last one, and I was always say this is the last course of action, just because it's both time consuming and it can be costly, is
Mm.
potentially litigation. Now, I think that's probably more common in, say, the US, and it does happen in Australia. But typically, the courts will ask, did you take any actions internally? Did you take any actions
Ah,
with the Fair
got
Work
it.
to kind of resolve it?
Got it.
And
Hence
if
the
you
steps.
have, exactly, and if you haven't done those things, you can have very good reasons why you haven't. So it's not that you have to, but if you don't have good reasons, sometimes the courts will say, well, we're not going to hear this until you've tried those options. And they might be able to conciliate or mediate, again, to save you some time and money, because they want to avoid clogging up the system. But those would be my steps that I would suggest. And I think maybe for a future podcast, Jeff, we could sort of talk about, what do you do if a bullying claim is kind of made against you? So whether you're the organization
Sure,
or
that'd be a
whether
great
you're
topic.
the individual, because look, I'd love to say that it never happens, but I think in some situations, particularly as an example, when someone maybe is having some performance management, conversations, that topic can come up. And, I think the main thing is that people are being treated fairly and reasonably. And so there's always two sides to any conversation. So happy for us to have that conversation,
Exactly.
maybe a future podcast there, Jeff.
Definitely. And don't mind me, Jan. And now obviously we talked about step one, going to your line manager, HR, or two up, depending on
Yep.
level of trust. Number
Mm.
two, go through sort of any sort of formal or informal channels to
Yep.
raise the issue.
Yep.
Number three, fair work and the association processes with that. And obviously, last, depending on the extremities of it all, litigation, right?
Yes.
But throughout steps 1 to 4, Jan, does this
Mm.
individual or group need to maybe document it, perhaps, or document these
Mm.
experiences, or how would you approach that question? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, with documentation, there's definitely lots of advantages to that. So,
Mm,
if you feel that you're being bullied, if anyone listening to this feels that they're being bullied, then I would definitely recommend documenting that. So any conversations that have been had and trying to capture that in a very objective, factual way. So what happened, no judgment applied. So instead of saying, they spoke to me very rudely, instead of writing something like that, writing down in your notes that, person X said, and then verbatim, what were the words? What was the tone? So you could say shouting if that's true. But I think avoiding any kind of judgments to try to make sure it's as objective as possible. Because what that allows is anyone who looks at that, whether they're internal, external, or a legal representative, is that they can look at that in a much more what's the best way to describe it, in much more of an objective way, so they can come to their own determination. Because when
mm,
we're in a
got it.
moment of and clout our ability to kind of write
Mm,
down factually what's happened. So if we do that ourselves, we help anyone else around us hopefully resolve it in a way that makes sense and protects our well-being.
got it. And obviously, there's no sort of taping. There's no sort of recording. That's a different field altogether.
Absolutely. So recording has to be completely agreed upon by both parties.
Yeah.
Again, this is Australian legislation specific. Now, of course, in an organization, remembering that any communication that you're using, whether it's things like Slack or email or Zoom, could be recorded by your employer. So I think just bearing that in mind. So, deciding where you capture your notes, that's also important as well, again, depending on the
Mm,
trust levels. All of those things come into play. So yeah, definitely not recording conversations unless both parties have agreed to that. That's really critical. The other thing I just say is, as a final, I guess, caveat, Jeff, is I think
mm,
if bullying's happening and you're not feeling safe and you don't feel the trust is there, I'm very much a big advocate of removing yourself from that situation, doing what's right for you to make sure that you're
mm.
safe. Because, at least in my perspective, that no job, no remuneration is worth poor treatment. So, if there's anyone out there that feels that it's not getting better, they're trying to address it, they don't have the trust there, I would
Mm.
really consider strongly: is it the right place for you? And considering removing yourself, or at least taking a big chunk of time off with your doctor, if you're feeling mentally strained by what's going on, as soon as possible. Because again, I don't think that you can put a price on mental health.
Agree. So overall, it's a very nuanced sort of topic here, but it's fantastic that, we now have, 4 good steps and sort of tips on how to approach.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure.